In 1992, a cartographer named Viktor Lebedev walked into the Library of Congress carrying a leather satchel containing documents that would force historians to question 70 years of accepted geopolitical truth. What he revealed wasn't just classified, it was architecturally impossible, according to every surveying manual published before 1955. How many other maps are still buried in vaults across 3 continents, deliberately kept from academic scrutiny because they prove our textbooks have been teaching a fundamentally incorrect version of 20th century territorial conflicts? Before we dive deeper into these cartographic anomalies that intelligence agencies try to erase from historical memory, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what these documents reveal about the hidden geography of espionage. Here's what makes these particular maps so unusual. First, several contain topographical features in the Kamchatka Peninsula that don't appear on any Soviet geological survey released to the public, yet American U-2 reconnaissance flights from 1960 confirm their existence. Second, there's a 1951 Polish military chart showing infrastructure in East Germany that wasn't supposed to be constructed until 1957, according to every declassified construction order from the Warsaw Pact archives. Third, a CIA analyst's personal collection included a hand-annotated map of Cuba with coastal markings that predate the Bay of Pigs invasion by 18 months, markings that perfectly correspond to underwater topography only confirmed by modern sonar mapping in 2003. These aren't just classification oversights. These are deliberate reconstructions of reality. The first map we need to examine came from the Soviet Main Directorate of Geodesy and Cartography, known by its Russian acronym GUG. During the entire Cold War, this organization produced 2 completely separate cartographic systems. The public system, used in schools and published at leases, contained systematic distortions. Roads were shifted by up to 15 kilometers. Rivers appeared where reservoirs actually existed. Mountain ranges had their elevations altered by as much as 300 meters. But the military system, the one used by strategic rocket forces, commanders and submarine navigators, contained something far more disturbing than mere inaccuracies. It contained predictions, features that shouldn't exist yet were already marked. A rail line through the Ural Mountains, officially completed in 1964, appeared on a classified 1958 General Staff map with exact kilometrage markers and gradient calculations. When engineers finally surveyed the completed route 6 years later, they discovered their measurements matched the classified map within a 2% margin of error. Either Soviet military cartographers possessed precognitive abilities, or long-term infrastructure projects were being planned and documented years before official authorization, then hidden from civilian oversight through deliberate map falsification. Years later, a similar pattern emerged from American sources. The Defense Mapping Agency, operating from its headquarters in Bethesda during the height of nuclear tensions, maintained what insiders called the Omega Collection. These were maps designated for presidential eyes only, updated weekly, showing not where Soviet assets were positioned, but where predictive algorithms suggested they would be positioned 3 to 6 months forward. The algorithms incorporated economic data, signals intelligence, and something called displacement topology, a classified mathematical framework that treated military installations as fluid entities responding to game-theoretic pressures, rather than fixed geographic points. In 1979, an Omega collection map predicted the establishment of a Soviet listening post on the Kamchatka coast near Petropavlovsk, with such precision that when satellite imagery confirmed its construction 4 months later, the coordinates were accurate within 50 meters. The map had been generated before any groundbreaking activity was detectable by existing reconnaissance technology. This suggests American intelligence had either penetrated Soviet strategic planning at the highest level, or they developed a form of probabilistic cartography so sophisticated it bordered on prophecy. Neither explanation appears in any official history. The third map requires understanding a man named Otto Meyer, a Stasi officer responsible for urban planning intelligence in divided Berlin. Meyer's specialty wasn't espionage in the traditional sense. He created what he called chronotopographic studies, maps that showed the same territory across multiple temporal layers simultaneously. his 1971 masterwork. Confiscated by West German intelligence after reunification and only declassified in 2008, depicted East Berlin with 3 overlaid realities. The first layer showed current infrastructure. The second showed planned construction for the next decade. The third layer, drawn in red ink with notations in a personal cipher that took cryptanalysts 9 years to break, showed what Mayer called inevitability architecture. These were structures he claimed would be built regardless of official policy because the underlying economic and social pressures made their construction mathematically certain. When researchers compared his red ink predictions to actual development between 1971 and 1989, they found an 87% accuracy rate. Buildings appeared where he said they would. Transit lines followed his projected routes, even after the Berlin Wall fell and East German planning documents became irrelevant. Construction in reunified Berlin continued to conform to patterns Mayer had sketched 2 decades earlier. His map wasn't predicting government decisions. It was predicting something deeper, more fundamental. It was predicting the inevitable logic of urban space itself. That same night, Mayer completed his chronotopographic study. Across the world in Virginia, a CIA cartographer named Marion Browning was working on her own temporal anomaly. Browning specialized in what the agency called retroactive mapping, creating charts of past events, using current intelligence to show what should have been visible to decision-makers at the time. Her 1971 Cuban Missile Crisis retroactive map has never been fully released, but portions that leaked through FOIA requests in 1998 show something disturbing. According to official histories, American intelligence discovered Soviet missile installations in Cuba through U to photography on October 14, 1962. But Browning's retroactive analysis, using signals intelligence data that wasn't declassified until the 1990s, proved that Pentagon analysts had sufficient information to locate the missiles by late September. They had intercepted Soviet communications referencing specific grid coordinates. They had tracked unusual shipping patterns to precise Cuban ports. They had even received reports from Cuban refugees describing construction activity at the exact locations where missiles were later photographed. Browning's map demonstrated that every piece of geographic intelligence necessary to identify the threat existed 2 weeks before the official discovery. The question her map poses, the question that still makes intelligence historians uncomfortable, is whether the delay was incompetence or strategy. Did decision-makers wait to discover the missiles at a politically optimal moment? Browning's notations suggest she believed the latter. Her map doesn't just show where missiles were, it shows where knowledge of missiles was deliberately not acknowledged. The pattern intensifies with a 1968 map from the British Joint Intelligence Committee, a document so sensitive it remained classified until 2019, 30 years beyond standard protocols. This map concerns Soviet submarine activity in the North Atlantic, specifically the GIUK gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. A choke point that NATO considered vital for detecting Soviet naval movements. The official narrative held that Soviet submarine technology in the late 60s was noisy, primitive, easily tracked by Western sonar arrays. But this map told a different story. It showed submarine transits through the GIUK gap at depths and speeds that shouldn't have been achievable with known Soviet propulsion systems. More troubling, it showed these submarines following routes that avoided every NATO listening station, despite those stations' locations being among the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. The map's annotations, written by an analyst whose name is still redacted, proposed possibilities. Either the Soviets had developed acoustic stealth technology a full decade before Western intelligence believed, or there was a compromise of NATO's underwater surveillance grid so complete that Soviet submarines were being given real-time navigation data, allowing them to slip through gaps in coverage. The map remained classified, not because it revealed NATO capabilities, but because it revealed NATO failures. It showed that the strategic choke point the entire Western naval defense strategy relied upon was functionally transparent to Soviet forces. By 1974, both American and Soviet military cartographers had begun incorporating something unprecedented into their classified mapping systems: probability clouds. Instead of marking enemy installations with precise symbols, they created gradient shadings representing likelihood distributions. A particular valley in Afghanistan might be shaded in progressive intensities of red, indicating escalating probabilities that insurgents' training camps would emerge there over the next 5 years. These maps didn't record reality. They recorded potential reality, treating geography as a probabilistic field where certain locations possessed higher activation energies for specific types of military or political events. A 1976 CIA probability map of Iran, partially declassified in 2004, showed unstable zones around Tehran and Qom 3 years before the Islamic Revolution. The probability clouds weren't based on specific intelligence about revolutionary planning. They were based on topological analyses of urban density, religious site distribution, economic inequality indices, and what one analyst called eschatological geography, the spatial relationship between populations and sites of religious significance. The map suggested that revolution wasn't planned in those locations. Those locations geometrically demanded revolution. When Ayatollah Khomeini's movement coalesced exactly where the probability clouds were darkest, intelligence analysts faced an uncomfortable conclusion. Geography itself might be deterministic. Space might constrain political possibility as surely as physics constrains atomic possibility. The most disturbing map in this collection isn't Soviet or American. It's East German, created in 1983 by a Stasi research unit designated Abteilung, a department whose existence wasn't confirmed until Stasi archives were opened in the mid. This unit specialized in what internal documents called successor state cartography. They created maps of a divided Germany that would exist after nuclear war, projecting radiation patterns, infrastructure collapse, population movements, and territorial control for up to 50 years post-exchange. The 1983 map, one of 17 produced between 1978 and 1989, modeled a scenario where NATO and Warsaw Pact forces exchanged tactical nuclear weapons across the inter-German border. What makes this map remarkable isn't its apocalyptic scenario, but its bureaucratic precision. It shows refugee routes marked with estimated flow rates in persons per hour. It shows contaminated zones with projected decontamination schedules. It shows new borders that would emerge not from political negotiation, but from the geographic logic of radioactive decay and surviving transportation networks. In this post-nuclear geography, Berlin ceases to exist as a political entity. The map shows it replaced by 3 separate survivor enclaves, each controlled by different military factions, none recognizing the other's authority. The cartographers anticipated that nuclear war wouldn't end the Cold War. It would fragment it into dozens of smaller Cold Wars fought across a devastated landscape, where the old borders had become meaningless. Abteilung XIV created these maps, not as hypothetical exercises but as navigation tools for Stasi officers expected to survive and maintain intelligence operations. In successor states, they were planning for Germany after Germany. Now, the technical challenge these maps present to historians goes beyond content. It's methodological. Traditional cartographic analysis assumes maps represent observable reality with varying degrees of accuracy and bias. But probability maps, chronotopographic studies, and successor state projections don't represent observable reality. They represent epistemological, post-spilly space. How do you fact-check a map of something that might happen? Soviet geodesists solved this problem by developing what they called retroactive verification protocols after predicted features appeared in reality. Cartographers would compare the prediction to the outcome and calculate a precision score. Over time, these scores were used to weight the reliability of different predictive methods. By the mid-80s, Soviet military cartography had essentially become a machine learning system decades before that term entered common usage. Maps were training data. Geographic reality was the test set. The system optimized itself to predict where infrastructure, military assets, and even political upheaval would emerge. Western intelligence agencies discovered these protocols when Soviet archives opened, and the discovery created a crisis in intelligence theory. If geography was predictable, if maps could show the future with 70 or 80% accuracy, then the Cold War wasn't a conflict between ideologies. It was a conflict between competing predictions of spatial inevitability. The question wasn't which system was morally superior. The question was, which system could more accurately predict where the future would physically manifest. The implications extend to cryptography in unexpected ways. In 1981, the NSA commissioned a study on what they termed cartographic entropy. The question they posed was whether geographic information could be compressed beyond normal data compression limits by exploiting predictive correlations. If you knew that certain types of terrain reliably produced certain types of infrastructure, you could encode massive amounts of cartographic data as algorithms rather than explicit coordinates. A 50 megabyte detailed map might compress to a 5 megabyte prediction function that, when run against terrain data, regenerated the original map with acceptable accuracy. But the study discovered something stranger. When they applied this compression technique to classified Soviet maps, they found redundancies that suggested Soviet cartographers were already thinking this way. Soviet military maps contained geographic features that appeared random, but when analyzed statistically, showed patterns consistent with algorithmic generation. The NSA analysts concluded that by the late 70s, Soviet military cartography had partially transitioned from empirical observation to generative modeling. They weren't just mapping the Soviet Union. They were running simulations of it, then selecting the simulation outputs that best matched reality, effectively treating the physical territory as one possible instantiation of an underlying geographic probability distribution. This implied Soviet strategic planning wasn't based on their country as it existed, but on their country as it probabilistically should exist. They were defending a mathematical abstraction. The final map, the one that ties these threads together, comes from a joint Soviet-American project that technically never existed. In 1987, during a brief thaw in relations, low-level cartographers from both sides met at a conference in Helsinki and discovered they'd been working on identical problems. Both had developed probability mapping. Both had encountered the same verification paradoxes. Both had arrived at the conclusion that Cold War geography was deterministic within certain error bounds. According to participants, who only spoke publicly decades later, they spent one night creating a collaborative map, merging American and Soviet probability data for the entire European theater. The resulting document showed high probability zones for conflict, détente, technological innovation, economic collapse, and political transformation across the next 2 decades. When they compared their map to actual European history between 1987 and 2007, the correlation was disturbing. The fall of the Berlin Wall occurred in a high-probability transformation zone. Yugoslavia's fracture followed predicted fault lines. Even the expansion of the European Union roughly matched projected economic integration corridors. The map was destroyed before the conference ended. Participants agreed it was too dangerous to exist, not because it revealed secrets, but because it suggested history itself might be geographically constrained, that the grand ideological struggle of the 20th century was just surface narrative playing out over deeper topological inevitabilities. So what we're left with isn't a question of which side had better maps, but whether maps during the Cold War stopped being representations and became prediction engines. Whether the intelligence agencies of that era stumbled into a form of applied historical determinism where geography plus time approximately equaled fate. Whether there are still maps in classified archives showing the next 30 years with the same disturbing accuracy, these showed their own futures. And if those maps exist, whether the events they predict are warnings or simply previews of what space itself has already decided will occur. The declassified maps don't rewrite history because they reveal hidden facts. They rewrite history because they suggest history might be cartographically computable, that the Cold War was fought not between nations but between competing models of inevitable geography, and that we still don't know which model was more accurate, because we're still living inside the probability cloud those maps projected. If these geographic prophecies have left you questioning what else intelligence agencies knew that they've never revealed, leave a comment with your theory about which current geopolitical situation might already be mapped out in a classified archive. Somewhere, hit that like button if you think prediction is just another form of control. And share this with anyone who still believes history is made by human decisions rather than topological constraints. The coordinates of the future might already be drawn. We just haven't been cleared to see the map yet.